it's important to understand the brain biology of what happens when any type of addiction disorder occurs. I spent my career dealing with, started out my career actually dealing with other food disorders, anorexia nervosa and bulimia, which are very severe, obviously, food disorders, and really are mirror images of the food addiction cycle. And then in the latter part of my career, the last 35 years, I've been working with alcohol and drug disorders. And the reason this is important is because they're all connected. So, we're going to start off with asking the basic question, is why do humans develop addiction disorders? Why does that happen to us? What is it about us that we are wired to do this? Because it doesn't seem like a positive thing for the species, right? Well, so how we're going to do this is by dividing the stages of addiction brain research into 3 distinct buckets of time. The first is the beginnings of all this, which is modern addiction research began with the discovery of the pleasure center. This is work by Olds and Milner. I'll talk with you a little bit about that. And that was way back in 1954. Subsequent research to that focused on acute changes in the brain when exposed to abusable substances. And that led to some distortions on us understanding addiction. So we're going to take a look at the research. We're going to see how it got a little sideways. And then the second piece of the lecture is going to be about changes in brain neural responsivity that occur when someone transitions from intermittent use or misuse, whether that be food or sugar, to addiction. And that's a much more recent transition in our understanding. And finally, we're going to talk where we're heading in terms of this research to more speculative, deeper centers that are beyond what we call the Mesolimbic reward center, that promote relapse into this recovery process. Because it's not, if we know how we get sick, it's only a little bit of information, right? If we know how we stay well, then we've really made some progress. And I'll talk to you about the neurobiology that subtends this whole process of staying healthy and staying well. That first era was from the 1960s and 1990s and really suggested that for the first time that addiction may be a brain disease. Previous to that, the original textbooks that I would read talked about it being a personality problem or a subset of some other psychiatric condition such as depression. And really with Olds and Milner's work and later in the 1970s and 80s when I started in the field, that shifted dramatically. What happened in this second stage is that it showed that there's a difference between abuse and addiction, and that all of us, everyone in the human culture, if we have access to substances, misuses substances, including food, right? There's no one that has a pure, healthy, totally healthy response to food, to alcohol. But some people have a little bit of misuse and some people have a whole lot. So how do we understand that spectrum? All right. And then that last phase increases our understanding of how addiction changes brain behavioral functioning. And that guides what we would call non-pharmacological treatment. What do we do behaviorally, psychotherapeutically to stay in remission from any kind of disorder of addiction? So we're going to start with the history piece first. History kind of helps us know where we're going and talk about this mesolimbic reward circuit. Has everyone heard of this phrase? Yeah, most everyone has. Okay, all right, but I'll talk more about it in a minute. We all know that prior to the 1970s, addiction was thought to be defined by the development of tolerance, so that if you had a heroin problem, the cause of the illness was the fact that you had withdrawal from it, so therefore you continued to use it. And that was the theory behind addiction for so long that people misunderstood the whole process of getting better dramatically. And the presence of withdrawal symptoms. If you stop binging on sugar and you feel blue, you have a tendency to return to it. And that was the definition of the causative agent in having the problem of addiction. And in case you haven't figured this part out, it was wrong. Okay? And that led to blunders in diagnosis. So for instance, the leading textbook of psychiatry in the US in the 1970s said that cocaine wasn't addicting. It said an interesting substance, tended to cause euphoria, a sense of grandiosity, but has no addictive potential. Well, they should have talked to Sigmund Freud, right, who had a problem himself with that. Okay. So the other piece that's interesting about addiction disorders is that it's not just Homo sapiens that has the problem. All higher mammals have this same disorder when given the right situations. And in fact, even if you entrain rats into an addictive process, they act the same way. They will do anything to continue the addiction disorder, even to the point of dying. And that's true, by the way, for any kind of addictive disorder, including food disorders or sugar disorders, opiate disorders, amphetamines, you name it. Anything that causes addiction, rats do the same thing. So we can actually study rats. That's the good news. Okay? And that's what Olds and Milner did. They discovered what was known then as by various terms. Today we're going to call it the reward center in 1954. And that was quite by accident. Basically, they were stimulating different parts of the rat brain, and they found out that animals would continue to seek this stimulation in this one particular area of the brain, enduring all kinds of negative things, electrical shocks, withdrawal of food, whatever, as long as they had access to this stimulating area of the brain with an electrode that was placed very deep within the brain. I'll show you where in a minute. They discovered, unlike the other natural rewards, interestingly enough, this would not satiate. Yeah, it would not satiate, unlike natural rewards such as water, food, and sex, where in this particular case, this stimulus area was very specific. And here's, I think this is going to be a picture. Let's see. Oh, I'm going to have it. Oh, well, on your right is a picture of the rat stimulating the bar, and they will literally sit on this bar until they are exhausted and fall down. Sound familiar? So later we discovered that certain substances also change something very specific in this neural circuitry. In this area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, which I'll show you in a second, certain drugs produced a massive spike in one particular neurotransmitter called dopamine. And so here you see the effect of different doses of morphine. The higher the dose, and the more rapid the dose comes on, and that's very important, by the way, the more that there's this long elevation in dopamine release. Same thing with cocaine, with doses going 3 times higher and 2 times higher morphine in terms of the level of dopamine in this area of the brain. And we also found out this was also true for other substances, such as nicotine, which causes a over 2-fold increase in the level of dopamine over a very short burst of time. Isn't that interesting? If you want to know what nicotine addiction is, you go to the theater and you watch people walking out of the movie so they can have a cigarette because they can't tolerate the withdrawal phenomenon, and that's because this peak is very short. Alcohol is a very complex relationship with these dopamine levels rising 2-fold, again, depending on the doses, and that's very consistent from that area. So we all know these substances do this, but what about other things? Well, let's talk about food and sex. Interestingly enough, bursts of sugar cause at least a 1.5 times increase in the level of dopamine in the same reward center, exactly the same neural circuitry. You can even take that same animal who has been exposed to cocaine or some other drug, they have a rise in the level of dopamine in this area of the mesolimbic reward area. And in a similar fashion, the food will do the same thing in that animal. And not surprisingly, of course, sex always comes into everything because we're human beings, right? But sex also, it causes a burst in that level of dopamine. Well, what does that burst of that level of dopamine cause? When you talk about that, the first thing people say is, oh yeah, you feel pleasure. Yeah, That's the upside of it. There's also the downside of it, right? So the problem with addiction is an imbalance in that up versus downside, and why some people respond differently has to do with their genetics. So all this research led to what's called the dopamine reward model, which came out right as Bitten and I were starting in the field, in the 1980s, early 1980s, that there was this rise in this dopamine, and it created this, that was what was thought subtended this whole process of all types of addiction disorders. We didn't know about food, by the way, then, or sex, because no one was researching that. But we knew that certain drugs caused those problems. And since then, we found that all drugs of misuse or abuse activate this circuit. They do it through a variety of neurotransmitter substrates, not just dopamine, but all human behaviors that are driven by reward originate in this circuit. So anything you do today, if you get to the end of the conference and you feel like you learned something, you say, that was great. That is a dopamine burst as well. It's all based upon that. It subtends all of our driven behaviors on some levels. Just the piece of it, though, the piece of it that's not the piece of it that says, I learned a lot. No, it's, wow, that was great. Okay. So the theory was in the 1980s, the dopamine discharge in this complex was to produce the pleasure and reward that caused addiction. And where is this area of the brain? This is a sagittal section, which means if I slice my brain in half, took away this half of the brain, the very center in these very deep areas of the brain is this ventral tegmental area with a set of projections or neurons that project forward to the nucleus accumbens. And this is the circuit that drives most of all of our deepest behaviors. And by the way, it also includes other things, such as the urge that happens when your children are young to feed them, to take care of them, to nurture them. All of that is also driven by it. So this area of the brain is super important for us. And if you take, in rat studies, if you take an electrode and ablate that area of the brain, interestingly enough, it feels, the animal can probably feel the pleasure, but they're not driven to continue it. So this is a driver circuit. Okay. The response of pleasure is actually a little bit downwind. This is the circuit that says, go do this. Okay? All right. So here's another picture of that circuitry. It's not just here. I just show these two parts of it where there are this nucleus accumbens driven forward. And again, this is that center part of the brain. This is your brain stem. This is really the oldest part of our brain. And that says, because it's so old, that says that's going to happen in all animals to varying degrees. All animals have this same circuit we have. It's very deep, it's very unconscious, and it is, there may be times when you don't even notice that it is driving you to do something. That gets the issue of relapse, right? Okay. And here's a better picture of it, that it actually does all kinds of things. How it activates these deeper areas is it sends signals into this frontal cortex that especially the motoric circuits that activate a response. Now, this is maybe a little more complicated, but I'll try to describe this. It means that once this circuit is activated, the behavior occurs before the knowledge or the recognition of it. And that's why these types of illnesses are so difficult to treat. When a therapist says, why did you have that drink? The patient says, I don't know. I just found myself in a bar with a pint in my hand. And that's actually a true rendition of how relapse occurs in many addiction disorders, is because these driver circuits drive behavior. And then later on, the brain shows up and say, hey, what the heck's going on here? I thought you told yourself you wouldn't drink. I thought you told yourself you wouldn't binge on that all that sugar? I thought you said you would stop eating refined carbohydrates because it made you ill. But the noticing of it occurs after the action. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. And actually, we've more recently we've mapped out all of these drugs. That any drug that is abusable activates these dopamine circuits. I'll only show you what I mean. I'm going to go back here. Here, this is the back of the brain. Here's your cerebellum here, right? And this is your all of your cortex. But these areas of the brain, the ventral tegmental area here is a nucleus accumbens in here. In this slide, unfortunately, just to confuse you, the ventral tegmental area is this area, and the nucleus accumbens is that area. So it's gotten flipped around. And we actually know today, for substances that are misusable, where in this small circuit of neurons, and again, this is the size of the tip of my baby fingernail, right? Not many, not very big. All those neurons, we know exactly which neurotransmitters do what and how they cause activation of this circuit. And that's true for all substances. Why do we not know that about behaviors and food? It's because it's just too complicated, right? We're not there yet. And it might be a while before we can figure out how to create the paradigms. But remember, boosts, especially of a load of glucose, dramatically accelerate the level of dopamine exactly in the same manner as substances of misuse do. Okay. So just to let you know, so for instance, alcohol actually activates opioid peptides in this area in the ventral tegmental area that project forward. This neuron fires something in the nucleus accumbens. The output of that is that driver that says, go do this. Okay. So later work by Kent Berridge is really important in this fact. Early research said the response to this was actually pleasure. But we found more recently that pleasure is only one of the parts of it and actually the least central to this whole mesolimbic reward circuit. And so actually, and he used, by the way, how he used this was he used a bolus of glucose to get these results. So he's really understanding that the bolus of glucose in rats is a lot easier to manage than having to put drugs in their brain. And what happens over time is how the brain responds is with what's called incentive salience. The brain is incentivized to see this signal as being important. Oh, this is important, right? So what happens over time is you learn how to, it entrains the brain to learn. You perfect how you misuse the substance. You become more and more efficient. If you have an alcohol use disorder, you figure out how to hide the alcohol. You figure out how to put, one great example is the hip flask. The hip flask was driven by this circuit because you could figure out how to put this little slim hip flask in your suit coat pocket so that no one would know. And the ability to sneak around and purchase drugs or to sneak food or to lie about it. The ability to learn how to be more efficient is part of this circuit. Because, remember, the original reason for this circuit is survival. We need to have food to survive, we need to have sex to survive, we need to nurture our children to survive, and we need to have safety to survive. And that's the original purpose of this circuit that gets hijacked in terms of addiction disorders. So the first thing that happens is learning. You perfect learning. I had a patient many years ago that in Atlanta that was in recovery from a bad cocaine problem and was doing very, very well. And he called me after he took a trip out to Seattle, Washington, and he said, Dr. Earley, let me tell you something. I got off the plane, I was taking a cab to my hotel room, and I was just, the cab was going through a particular area of town, and I looked out the window and I said, I could buy cocaine here. And he said, how did I know that? I said, because your brain is so tightly attuned that you can see whatever it is, scan the environment and understand how to do that because it's prioritized. The brain is prioritizing this behavior. Unfortunately, what happens over time is liking goes down, though. So what at first seems like a pleasurable response pretty soon becomes, that was okay. But remember, the learning is high, and this is the kicker. The wanting undergoes this sigmoidal curve where it starts increasing during the period of the romance with the substance, and then it leaves at a high level. So what happens is you're left with high drives to procure, an ability to do it very efficiently, and you don't like it very much. Sounds like fun, right? Yeah. So it's remarkable work by Kent Berridge, and it basically says what it's like to be addicted. When I talk to my patients, what it's like to have the problem is it used to be fun, it's no longer fun, I can't help myself, I'm so driven to do that. And boy, am I good at it. And how he got to this was very interesting. What he did is he destroyed this ventral tegmental area in the rats and noted that they continued to enjoy food, but they wouldn't work for it. So if you ablate this area of the brain, the pleasure part of it was still there. But the only way they could know that, and it's complicated how they knew that the rats like things, but apparently these neuroscientists know how to do that. There's certain mouth movements apparently in the rat that reflect pleasure. Didn't know that. I'm sure this is important why you came here to learn that too. So that seminal study showed that with years of supporting research led to the conclusion that the ventral tegmental area nucleus accumbens circuit produces wanting rather than reward. It's best at producing hunger or wanting. And this last quote is so wonderful from one of his mentors, Dr. Robinson. This explains why life's intense pleasures are less frequent and sustained than intense desires. And that's true for all of us, I'm sure, right? Okay, so we've talked about this circuit as being essential to anything that becomes addictive for us. And we actually know from that a little bit about those circuits that subtend that. So, by the way, it's fine to take pictures, but you can also probably, I think I sent in the slide set, right? So you can download the slides too, the PDF of the slides. So yeah. I'm fine with you taking pictures too, but I just want to let you know. So what happens, and again, I'm going to use the drug use, and the drug here might be sugar. But the drug use at first just produces pleasure. But what happens from Kent Berridge's work is it produces what's called signal salience. Something important is happening here. And that changes motivational circuits. If it's something that's important, the brain perfects how to continue that process. And that, in turn, creates this cycle of substance use, signal salience, changes in the motivation, drug use. And it keeps on getting more and more intense. And on top of that, we'll talk about this at the end of the lecture, what happens is there's a memory consolidation of that event. Now you can imagine why, when we're hunter-gatherers and food was in a short supply, why this was there. If you're a hunter-gatherer and you come across a patch in the spring of wonderful sweet berries, and you sit and eat those berries, you say, wow, what a great find. You're going to know next spring how to get to that berry patch. And the reason you're going to know is because it's synonymous with survival. When there is a food shortage in our environment, perfecting the foraging process is critical. And now we live, as we all know, in this area of food excess and too much refined sugar. So we don't have to forage very well. I mean, I went down to breakfast this morning and looked at all of the food and said, oh, that's my foraging, and I'm good at this. But I have to get good at going the other way too, right? So we're going to talk about this part first, and then we're going to talk about memory consolidation in a minute. And in fact, this area of the brain is also involved with an important concept from George Koob, who's the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, that he calls allostasis. And that over time, what happens with the process of addiction is at first you feel your mood is elevated by this, and then you return to baseline. And then each time you continue to use, your mood gets less elevated, and the down parts, the more depressive parts of the process, become more and more intense. And he uses these barbells, if you will, these kettlebells, I don't know what they are, whatever, to describe the things which make it worse. And the first is genetic phenomenon. 50% of the driver for addiction disorders, for substance addiction disorders, is in genetics. So when I teach my medical students or residents, I say, what's the one thing that if you could learn would help you more in understanding addiction proclivity in a patient that's sitting in front of you? It's, did your parents have a substance use disorder? And if you have any kind of addiction disorder, by the way, the susceptibility, that susceptibility is the same. Doesn't matter if it's food or cocaine or heroin or whatever. It's that this circuit appears to be a little off in one subset of Homo sapiens. And that makes them susceptible. So half of the driver, 50% of the driver for addiction is in your genes. So that's why we see people that have food disorders tending to come from families where there are other types of substance use disorders. So that's first, that's genetics. That pulls down this allostasis part. Then if there's issues such as childhood trauma or psychiatric comorbidity or substance use, it all pulls things down, further down. So every patient that comes in with an addiction disorder, and this is one of the biggest problems in the US. I don't know if it's a problem in the UK and in the rest of Europe and Iceland, but the biggest single problem I have with physicians who don't understand addiction disorders, they say, but I think it's depression. They're coming in, they're all sad. I say, yeah, I get that, but you need to kind of look at the whole thing, and their sadness isn't going to get any better. You treat the depression, sure. But you also know in a subset of those people, the sadness and depression is caused by this factor. Right? Okay. So there are also some what are called anti-reward effects. As the illness progresses, the rewarding effects of the substance use disorders wane and replaced by the negative effects by repeated use. Starts out to be fun, becomes less pleasant, and that includes some feelings of depression, dysphoria, irritability, malaise, and the feeling of crawling out of one's own skin. And that is what it's like for our patients. And people that don't understand addiction, they say, they just like to have fun. Oh, no, does it look like they're having fun? Your patients come in to see you, they're miserable, they're complaining, they're whining, they're depressed, they can't stop drinking, their parents are mad at them, their father, their mother, their wife, their husband, their children. Hey, sounds like fun. Okay, so the anti-rewarding effects override any of that possibility of reward. So, and this is another great slide from George Koob. We won't spend too much time on it, but he talks about the fact that part of this substance use cycle is a cycle, that there is a binge intoxication or binge phenomenon followed by some withdrawal or negative affect. So, and often during that time you say, oh God, I'll never do that again. That was crazy. Why did I do that? Followed by this kind of sense of a preoccupation or anticipation followed by binge. And this binge cycle came to the fore really with research on cocaine addiction, where it's really prevalent. People will go on binges for a day or two at a time, stop and say, they'll call me up, say, Doc, I can't believe it, I binged again. I say, okay. And they say, but I'm never going to do it again, I feel so bad. I say, well, good luck with that, right? Because that negative withdrawal, what might be in someone that doesn't have an addiction disorder, that might be incentive to not go further, right? If you don't have a food disorder and you overeat, it might be, that negative experience might be enough to say, I'm just not going to do that next time. But it's not when addiction takes hold. Okay. So, we've got this model about this mesolimbic dopamine reward system, right? And it contributes a lot to our understanding, including why life's pleasures seem more elusive, and the downside of this process become more and more severe over time, why you have increased wanting, why you get better at procuring the substance to continue to use. But we're still missing some pieces of it. And this is, so this dopamine allostasis model says, well, addiction's a brain disease. Okay, got it. It says that addiction hijacks life-sustaining primitive drives for food, water, sex, procreation, and childbearing. Got it. It says that addiction is not drug-specific, that food and any other drug that activates this ventral tegmental area nucleus accumbens complex can and does trigger the illness in a susceptible individual. And that why the positive effect of the substance is replaced by the negative. It explains all this, but it fails to explain some interesting other things that we want to know about. Why does the pleasure decrease? Well, we know a little bit about that from this model, but there's something more. Why do people relapse after long periods of abstinence? Why does that happen? Because after long periods of remission, you would expect that the brain readjusts and is not somehow gets better, but it doesn't, does it? And it doesn't explain the phenomenon of euphoric recall. Does everyone know what that is? Yeah, if you haven't experienced it, you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and you say, yeah, the first time I drank, oh, was it sweet? I was in the bar with my friends, we were all laughing and blah, blah, blah. And you can see that faraway look on their eyes. Right? That's euphoric recall. And euphoric recall is a hardwired, lifelong phenomenon. One of the things I teach my patients is, if you still look upon the craziness of your addiction and get this faraway, positive look in your eyes, that's normal. Don't beat yourself up for it. That's how your brain is miswired. And if anything, it's a symptom that you're still susceptible, right? And it doesn't explain why denial is pervasive and persistent. One of the weirdest things about this illness, and it's so pervasive that early textbooks said people that have addiction disorders are just sociopaths. They're liars. Well, they're liars, but they're lying to themselves, and they can't recognize it, right? Your friends say, gee, you need to stop that. And you go, I'm okay, right? And I stopped last week, so it's going to be okay now. And I don't have that problem anymore, right? But in truth, addiction is a chronic, lifelong illness that is managed much like diabetes or hypertension is. So we're going to explain that as we move forward, okay? Is everyone with me so far? Yes. Okay, great. So this next phase of the talk is going to be talk about addiction, a disease of learning and memory. And how I got onto this was a quote, an article by Steve Hyman. At that time, he was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health. And this is a paper called Addiction, a Disease of Learning and Memory. It was a theoretic paper that he wrote, a brilliant man. I'm going to read this quote to you. If neurobiology is ultimately to contribute to the development of a successful treatments for drug addiction, researchers must discover the molecular mechanisms by which drug-seeking behaviors are consolidated into compulsive use, the mechanisms that underline the long persistence of relapse risk, and the mechanisms by which drug-associated cues come to control behavior. Evidence is converging to suggest the view that addiction represents a pathological usurpation of the neural mechanisms of learning and memory that under normal circumstances serve to shape survival behaviors related to the pursuit of rewards and the cues that predict them. And I read that and I said, wow, this is an area I need to do more research on and understanding it. So, what we know is this area of the brain, this mesolimbic dopamine reward system, has powerful drivers in other areas of the brain. And I'm going to mention these. This is going to get a little technical with me for a minute, so just hang with me. It inhibits executive control centers. Yeah, I shouldn't do that, but I'm gonna. Right? It activates motivational and attention circuits. If you're a recovering substance user and you walk by a bar, even though you're in good recovery for your alcohol use disorder, you're going to go like this, right? I mean, and you shouldn't blame yourself for it. You can just say, well, there it goes again. I got to, right? Drug cues that command attention by activating the amygdala. Any kind of relapse cues, whether it be for sugar, whether it be for cocaine, whether it be for alcohol, they command attention through your amygdala, another part of your brain. They say, this is important. Memory circuits, and that's the entrainment of what's called procedural memory. I'll tell you about that in a minute, but if this is not a memory of when Columbus discovered what he thought was America, when he landed in the West Indies. This is that kind of date in my mind is what's called an episodic memory. Procedural memory is how I'm walking back and forth here without thinking about it and not running into the table or not tripping or maybe not tripping. We'll see what happens. Okay. And then brain circuits that activate stress and modulate emotions, and then higher cortical areas that actually make judgment as to cause and effect. And this is really important. And I'll get to this in a minute. All of these we're going to cover in the second half of this lecture, so there's a lot here. So we know this drives the brain. This is really the how it gets entrained part of how the brain gets entrained and why this is so sticky as a process, a phenomenon. So here are the four. This is a classic picture from our National Institute of Drug Abuse, and you can tell because they took a picture of a plastic model and then someone drew pictures on it. If it was from a drug company, it'd be fancy and things would be moving around. But this is just a cheap plastic model. Now here is, you're moving for me? Okay, I'll try not to move too much more. Here's a nucleus accumbens in what this is called the VP, or ventral pallidum, which is the ventral tegmental area, same thing. That's that circuit. But that sends signals up to the orbital frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the central gyrus there, back to the amygdala, which is part of our emotional center, and something, the hippocampus, that has to do with memory. And each of these circuits are activated by substance use disorder one by one. The first is this inhibitory control area of the brain. And that means that comes from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and orbital frontal cortex. Those are areas involved in inhibitory decisions. So that area of your brain is activated when you say, gee, I'd really like to go out and see what's happening in Bristol this evening, but I've got a lecture in the next morning. Right? So when that was going, my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex said, nah, you should not do that. You ought to get a good night's sleep. And if it's working in me, I go get the sleep. If it's not working, who knows what happens. So what happens once addiction occurs is this area of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and I think I've got a picture of the orbital frontal cortex right here, is that area right above this ridge where your eyes are and the socket is. That's right. If I put my finger here, that's where the orbital frontal cortex is. They're involved in inhibitory decisions, immediate versus delayed responses, and weighing the importance of various goal-relating behaviors. It's always saying, like when I'm speaking now, when I'm saying, should I talk about this more? Should I stop? Does this make sense? My orbital frontal cortex it's going wild, right? Because it's always trying to figure out where I should go. So addiction produces a decreased sensitivity to non-drug reinforcers and a decreased ability to inhibit maladaptive or disadvantageous behaviors. Because remember, this is an important primitive drive. It says, don't worry about that stuff. You need to do this. Inhibitory control problems can be picked up, by the way, often on some neurophysiological tests. If any of you are do neurophysiological studies as a psychologist, you could use a Stroop or Wisconsin card sorting test, that sort of thing, that of executive functioning, especially the Stroop, by the way. Any interference task, you can detect that in people early on in remission. And this is the work of Nora Volkow and Rita Goldstein. So that's inhibitory control, which is, inhibitory control is inhibited, right? Which means you go. The second area is this orbital frontal cortex in motivational and drive. Now, how that works is under normal conditions, this prefrontal cortex creates a representation of goals. If I'm moving on to the next slide, my brain is thinking about what am I going to say in that next slide and how am I going to be able to say it. And it currently is going a little nutty, so I can make this a little less boring. But it assigns value to them, selecting actions that attain goals. And then the anterior cingulate, right here, the ACC, focuses attention and monitors performance. So we all know about attention deficit disorder, right? Stimulants have a lot of effects on the brain, but the only one you really care about for attention deficit disorder is how it activates this anterior cingulate cortex. It creates focus. So that's what happens under non-addicted conditions. But when addicted, addiction-related stimuli, they produce what's called a superphysiological response using a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And it sends, it goes to the nucleus accumbens, which simulates the drug seeking. A lot of that unconscious drug seeking occurs through this circuit. And that's the diagram. I'm not going to go over it, but then this too is Peter Calaves and Nora Volkow's work at NIDA. This complicated ventral tegmental area nucleus accumbens creates a circuit which basically stimulates this process of drug seeking. So I kind of have this love-hate relationship with things that are like pastries and stuff, you know. I kind of go, oh, I shouldn't, should I, do I want? You know, all that is happening in my orbital frontal cortex, which is trying to control that behavior. That usually wins. Okay, so we've talked about the motivation and drive, the inhibitory control. Let's talk about how memory and learning is affected here. So, addiction really has lots of similarities with other types of what are called neuroplasticity, the ability to learn. And your brain doesn't know the difference between a natural reward-based learning, having a fine time with your friends, talking with them, chuckling, laughing, and the stimuli produced by addiction. And addiction really drives that. So how that works is in several different ways. And these are the three ways we were going to catalog today. One is what are called drug cues or substance cues. So if I see a pastry, I am cued by that, right? Addiction entrains drug or alcohol foraging and procedural memory. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And finally, there's a post-traumatic stress disorder like recall of substance-related events. There are times when you go, oh, God, I can't believe I did that. That shiver is actually a little mini post-traumatic stress disorder event. And all of us have little ones. PTSD is just when that becomes a huge problem for people. So all of us have this response to positive events, the drug cues, the relearning, and addiction flashbacks. I'm going to describe those next. Okay, so what happens with cue-based craving? The brain embeds this experience of substance use, adding environmental stimuli to produce what we call an addiction memory. So the first time you had a very positive response to substances, you will recall that place for the rest of your life. You'll say, I remember that place. I remember that room. I remember those people I was with. I remember how I felt that time. I remember because I was all alone, because I was with these people, because the walls were green. You can paint all of that memory. And that memory sometimes comes back at the wrong time. And what happens when that occurs is relapse, right? So what you have to do with patients in working on their remission from any kind of addiction disorder, food disorder, is catalog these things. Well, when you think about the past, when did it work for you? When was that positive time? And they go, I don't want to talk about it. What's that? They're having this negative response from the recall, right? You say, I understand. We need to know those so that when they occur to you, what you can do is tag it and say, okay, I need to figure out how to handle that memory when it comes up. I can say, that's the past, that's not today, and then do several things. Thought blocking, thought switching, there are all sorts of different techniques you use in relapse prevention there. So it brings credence to the aphorism from AA that says change playmates, playgrounds, and playthings, because the environment stimulates a relapse. It's not the environment's fault. It's that the brain remembers that stuff in a very deep, entrenched way. And that's why you get rid of the playgrounds of your past substance use. The strong cue remains embedded in this amygdala, and it's just sitting around waiting for reactivation. And it has the habit of doing it at the worst possible time. Isn't that funny? The amygdala signals this ventral tegmental area through, we even know the neurons that subtend this. The glutaminergic circuits, that's a glutamine, it's a particular neurotransmitter that establishes the hunger and urgency associated with cue-based craving. And then that memory is stored in the hippocampus and becomes episodic. It comes up at times when you're, writing a paper or you're sending an email, and all of a sudden you have this intrusive memory. And those are the circuits that subtend this. Here's the hippocampus, and here's the amygdala here. And this is from Bain et al., the neurobiology of addiction memory. Okay, the next one is procedural memory, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about memory, but everyone in here knows what procedural memory is. If you know how to ride a bike, you know how to ride a bike for the rest of your life, right? But if you were to ask me, how does the motor end plate from the neuron to the muscle activate the muscle? I would go, I learned that at some point. I can't quite pull it up. But if I get on a bicycle, I can remember a bicycle. Unfortunately, I don't ski very often, but it's my favorite thing to do in the world. But every time I get on my skis, I say, am I going to be able to do this? And I get on my skis and I say, oh, I know how to do this, right? That's procedural memory. And the problem with addiction is it entrains your procedural memory as well. Things that are important in procedural memory are hardwired at a place below our consciousness. If you were to say, well, Paul, how do you know to ride a bike? What do you do? I say, well, I can describe it, but it seems very awkward compared with the process, right? Well, I move this foot this way and this foot this way. Then again, on the bike, it's just like, right? I don't have to think about it. And procedural memory is critical for addiction. It's critical for relapse because the brain learns how to do things in circuits that are below our consciousness, so therefore difficult to inhibit, right? So this is how this happens. The basal ganglia, which are right around that ventral tegmental area, project back into the cerebellum, which controls a lot of motor movement, and that has to do with with most of procedural learning. These attentional circuits that I talk about, and then dopamine-mediated incentive salience. Now you know that term. You're going to be able to say, oh yeah, that's dopamine-mediated incentive salience in action. Okay? That direct the basal ganglia to record behaviors that result in drug procurement. Basically, those areas that say, this is important. Just like when I get on my skis, it's important that I don't fall down the hillside and kill myself, right? So somehow you really learn how to do these things because they are synonymous with not having negative things happen to you. Repeated use over time perfects and automates alcohol and drug procurement. It's just like getting on a bike, or the food procurement. You know how to hide it. You know how to minimize it. You know what to say when you're accused by your spouse of, did you do that again? You go, no, that was my friend Johnny. He came over. Yeah, that wasn't me, right? And when stimulated by related cues, automatically and partial automatic relapse behaviors ensue. That's why you have to figure out how to change your behavior, not just how you think about it, to remain in remission from any addiction disorder. You can't just say, I'm going to change how I'm going to say this isn't good for me and I'll get better. Good luck with that. Right? What really gets you better is learning the skills that prevent you from being in a high-risk situation. And like all procedural learning, the knowledge is automated, rigid, lifelong, and partially unconscious. And it makes sense when we understand how this basic primitive circuit activates this process. For some reason, the brain confuses the addictive process with life-sustaining processes. And so it gets really good at learning how to kill you. Okay, then lastly, what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder? Am I running late? What time?
It's nearly 10:05, so you've got another 10-15 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, I'm almost at the end. Great.
Great. I have loads of questions.
Okay, so what happens to post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, when an acute trauma is too overwhelming and repeated, what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder is the brain can't process that. And it becomes stuck, actually, most commonly in your visual memory. We don't understand why this is, but it creates a trauma tape. How you deal with that is you numb. So you numb yourself to avoid emotionally experiencing the trauma event. And by the way, having an addiction disorder is traumatizing, right? It is very traumatic to your sense of well-being. But it also means that if you have past traumas in your life, they unconsciously become attached to the addiction disorder because it's the same process. That's why people with addiction disorders, they might have even a mild post-traumatic stress disorder from a past event. But the addiction disorder demands that be tended to in order for the best prognosis to prevent relapse. That's why these two illnesses are joined at the hip, post-traumatic stress disorder and addiction, is because they both use that same circuitry. At times, dreams and meaning extraction doesn't occur, and that creates a susceptibility to recurrence, a so-called trauma bonding, where you are reattached to the problem, or trauma reenactment here. So post-traumatic stress disorder becomes part of the problem, and dealing with a healthy remission is part of the formula as well, if it occurs. And most of us in this room have at least some minor types of trauma. Some of us have major types of trauma. But if you also have an addiction disorder, the remission from the addiction disorder, successful remission, often demands that the post-traumatic stress disorder be addressed. That's why, by the way, if you're working in this field, you say, well, is everyone on this planet this traumatized? No, you just happen to be picking out a subset of people that do that. And it's interesting in a way because we get it that there is, with post-traumatic stress disorder, there is a fear, excitement, and release that's very similar to the process of being involved with your addiction. So the addiction process itself is traumatizing as well. Okay, that produces addiction flashbacks. These are intrusions. They have sensory properties, mental images, not just verbal thoughts. And they come to mind unbidden, not deliberately recalled, and they share the same circuitry as post-traumatic stress disorder. And here's where the brain is stimulated doing a PTSD episode, and here is your ventral tegmental area nucleus accumbens down here. Here's your visual cortex being activated here, and here's your motivational circuits being activated here. Okay. All right, so that's my talk. I just want to tell you a little bit about the last part about it. Is a group of us are involved in a process of trying to figure out how to systematize addiction care. It's called Recovery Mind Training. I'll be talking about that tomorrow at the conference tomorrow. And the way, when I want to talk to patients, I don't go into this detail. Their eyes would glaze over. They say, "Oh, please. Oh, is your treatment to bore me to death?" I've had patients say that because I love this stuff, right? It activates my mesolimbic dopamine reward center to talk about it. But the way we encapsulate all these phenomenon in addiction is what we call addict brain, and the type of remission is called recovery mind training, and the skills to get there. So those are the two things that we use to the addict brain I described today in its wholeness, in all of the stuff that it does, not just the fact that this one mesolimbic reward system is activated. That is the primary trigger, but the phenomenon extends throughout the brain. Thank you.